Hello and welcome again to Towards a Christian TTRPG. I've got my black hoodie on because I want to ask, what makes a good villain? Now in the Bible there are many villains, both human, societal and spiritual, including the devil, who I guess is really the ultimate villain. These villains range from human enemies such as Cain, Goliath, Jezebel, Amalek, Absalom, Saul, the King Saul, Haman, Herodias, etc., etc., etc. There are also societal and cultural enemies which the Israelites go to war against, including the Edomites, Ishmaelites, Moabites, Hagrites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Acterions, and most famously, of course, the Philistines. And of course, there are spiritual enemies, such as demons, devils, spiritual powers, including things like thoughts, perspectives, ideals that promote things that are ungodly, which includes, I guess, sin itself. So before I talk about villains in a game, I just want to make a few points. Firstly, not every game needs to have an enemy, at least not as we would generally define it. That is, a person who is actively opposed or hostile to someone or something. Some games can be about exploring issues or situations and about figuring out what the right thing to do is. Some games can be about learning how to work together. Some games can be about solving a problem or a mystery rather than actively defeating an enemy. All this is well and good. However, a lot of people want to play because they want to be the hero of the story. And in order to be a hero, they need to be able to defeat a villain. I've said this before in a previous video, but one of the main reasons people play games, just like when they want to watch a movie, like an action movie or a thriller, is to be able to win. To either watch or be the hero who rises from the ashes and puts the beat down on the villain. The problem with that is in the Bible, especially in the Gospels and the New Testament, the way you win is not by physically beating the villain, but by redeeming them. In the story of the prodigal son, the prodigal, is the bad guy. He's the villain of the story, even though we spend most of the story with him and he's the protagonist and has most of the character arc. The way that his villainy is beaten is through changing his mind and being accepted back to the family. Despite the fact that the older brother didn't like it, it's still the point of the story. It illustrates the principle of redemption. Having said that, though, in terms of creating a story, it's not up to the creator of the game or the game master how the players of the game choose to deal with the villain or how they solve whatever the problem is. That's up to the players themselves. In the Old Testament, a lot of the enemies the Israelites faced were other cultures, representing other gods and values that went against the commands taught by God. So the solution was to either not have anything to do with them, or, if there was conflict, to actively fight against them. So having said that, in your game, if you want to create a villain, how do you go about it? So some of the most famous villains tend to be ones that stand out in the audience's mind as being characters in their own right. What I mean by that is they're not just another obstacle for the hero to overcome or just a contrivance of the plot, but they have their own backgrounds, their motivations, strengths, weaknesses, and of course, an actual personality, not just a ball of rage. I think if we look at some of the more famous villains in recent times that people remember, people like Darth Vader, Silco from Arcane, Tywin Lannister from Game of Thrones, and even characters like Thanos from the Marvel movies, who was such a good villain, he even had his own hero's journey. We can probably draw a few generalizations about what could possibly make a good villain. So firstly, villains need to be powerful. Obviously, a good villain needs to stand in direct opposition to the hero and what the hero needs to do, whether that means actively working against them or doing something that stands against what the hero believes in. But in order to be credible as a villain, or if they're lucky, a nemesis, if they're really lucky, the villain needs to be powerful enough to be at least a match, or sometimes more than a match for the hero. In a lot of stories, confronting the villain is a significant part of the hero's growth, and sometimes even the origin story. And the fact that a lot of stories start with the villain doing something terrible to the hero's family, or murdering their parents, or something, and the young hero tries to stop them, but they can't, and therefore it becomes a classic coming-of-age story, where the hero decides they have to develop their skills and make themselves stronger to seek justice or revenge, or both. This is such a common trope that both Batman and Spider-Man's origins are based around that. Now, obviously, if you're designing the story for a game, you can't depend on this. If someone puts it into their backstory, obviously then it's fair game for you to use, and it's a free pass for you to use that, but only for that character. Otherwise, if all the characters stand for a particular value system, then the villain must be powerful enough to cause a problem for those values in some meaningful way. For example, if the heroes come from a tight-knit community, then the villain might be shutting the community down. If the hero is poor, then the villain is making it even harder to escape poverty or exploiting the poor in some way. Essentially, whatever the hero values, that should be the very thing that the villain either controls or is aiming to control. For example, controlling the hero's family by holding them hostage, controlling their freedom by preventing them from escaping, controlling their sense of justice by getting away with crimes, etc. Competent. The villain needs to be at least semi-competent in what they're planning to do in order to be a viable threat, and also competent in dealing with any other threats besides the hero themselves. So, for example, the villains in the Die Hard movies, they have no problems in dealing with the security guards. They can deal with the police department. They can even deal with the FBI. Easy. But they can't handle a single lone cop who proceeds to kill them all off one by one. And this is accepted because that's the nature of being the hero. The villain needs to be competent because they are the way that the hero shows their own strength and competence in defeating them. If the villain appears less than competent, then the hero appears less than competent in defeating them. Now, the competence may be in the same skills that the hero has, for example, being a better or just as good fighter or warrior than the hero is, or a better lawyer or business person or whatever it is. But it has to be something that the hero has to prove themselves in, not usually for their own sake, but usually to protect someone or to protect some kind of ideals. The greater the competence of the villain, then the greater the threat, and the greater the stakes, and the more interesting the story. Which leads us to smart. Generally speaking, villains are much better at strategy than they are at tactics. What I mean by that is the villains are better at creating long-term evil plans and schemes than they are at dealing with contingencies. Often villains are better at crafting grand plans and conspiracies than the heroes are. As a result, villains tend to be much more proactive, especially in their plans, and heroes tend to be much more reactive and are basically looking to keep the status quo the way it was. Heroes still need to be smart, and in the movie or a game, the hero needs to figure out how to defeat the villain, but that's not usually the emphasis of the story. Often we're just told how to do it. There's some exposition that the hero is told, this is how you defeat the person, and the emphasis on the story is in actually doing it rather than just figuring out how. One of the advantages of this in a game is that often the players are required to be better at tactics, and the players are required to make choices in the moment rather than sit around and sort of come up with long-term strategy. This generally means that fights and combat is less a game of chess and more a game of poker, with each player trying to do their best with what they have on hand at the time to cause the most loss of the other side in the current round. So it's basically a hand-by-hand perspective. Often the heroes will enter the story at 3 different stages. There may be, number 1, the villain's plan is in motion but not yet complete. Number 2, the heroes and villains are trying to achieve the same thing at the same time, like a treasure hunt. Or 3, the villains have already achieved their goals and the hero has to topple them from power, like an evil dictator or like the Empire in Star Wars. Emotionally controlled. Another thing that makes a good or compelling villain is the ability to be in control of their emotions or relatively dispassionate. For some reason, villains who are reasonably calm and composed, like Hans Gruber from Die Hard, Darth Vader, Tywin Lannister, Thanos, Hannibal Lecter, tend to give out a greater sense of menace. Villains that are emotional and volatile can still be seen as dangerous simply because they're unpredictable, but they have to be very powerful, and able to cause a lot of actual harm. Otherwise, a lack of control can be played for laughs and make them seem weaker. Having said that, though, there are volatile villains who can be very scary simply because they are so naturally dangerous. Villains like Homelander from The Boys, who is essentially an evil Superman, or villains like Mr. Mxyzptlk from Superman, or the Joker from Batman, who are still smart and competent, but also dangerous because they are unpredictable. Have some flaw or weakness that can be exploited. Now, often this could be the MacGuffin or the objective that the heroes are trying to get to or trying to destroy. But for other villains, it can be other things. For Darth Vader, it was Luke. For Thanos, it was the Infinity Stones. For Silco in Arcane, it was Jinx. For Tywin Lannister, it was his family, etc., etc. Every villain needs to have some kind of weakness or flaw, which the heroes can exploit. You can't have a literally unbeatable villain. That becomes a horror story, and after a while becomes kind of boring if you cannot do anything about it. Ideally, heroes also should have weaknesses or flaws that the villain can exploit at the same time. The best stories and games should incorporate both of these weaknesses to heighten the conflict and add some more engagement, both from the players and, if it's just a story, from the audience. Some of these flaws or weaknesses can be revealed through the conflict itself, such as a reveal of a betrayal, or the fact that this person was in debt to the villain the entire time, or something like that. Similarly, in the game, if the heroes are busy trying to defeat the villain by destroying the MacGuffin or exploiting the villain's weakness, there is nothing stopping the villain from trying to exploit theirs in the same way. You see this happening when the villain offers the hero a deal to just walk away, or the villain says they really don't want anyone else to get hurt, or in some cases they will threaten the people that the hero cares about, and because they realize that this person is the hero's weakness and they want to exploit it. Again, this leads back to the previous points that the villain needs to be powerful and competent enough to make the promise or the threat real. It depends how evil you want to make your villain, as to whether they see themselves as being a reasonable person and offers the hero a deal, or they see themselves as desperate enough to threaten another person's life, because their goal is so important that the end justifies the means. If you do this in your game or story, it's probably better to slowly escalate the villain's behavior from warnings to general threats to making a deal to stopping the heroes in some other way, like arresting them or something like that, up to specifically threatening harm on a person to get them to stop. Because each time the villain is crossing a new line and is justifying their behavior in a new way, and often the villains say, "You made me do this," or "You forced me up to this point." This is still a kind of character development. So it's a character arc for the villain and can make a very compelling character arc, but it's a downward one, obviously. And if the hero's ultimate goal is to actually try and redeem the villain, if that is their goal, then that also gives them an opening by asking the villain if the end goal is actually worth the sacrifice. Is it worth going to jail over? Is it worth murdering somebody over? Is it worth losing your soul? And then leave it to the villains whether they want to say yes or to say no. If they do say no, it's not worth it, and they stop what they're doing, then bear in mind that you can't rob your players or your audience from a suitable climax. If they're going to talk the villain down, if the heroes do that, then it needs to have as much emotional weight to it as a final action sequence, especially if that's what they're expecting. There needs to be a suitable payoff for the emotional investment that the players or the audience have given. Usually this is easier with an action scene because it's something the players can get involved in and do that sort of stuff, but sometimes it can be just as good to have the villain join forces with the hero to battle. Maybe there's a larger enemy, or maybe even to take down their own scheme, their own minions or something like that they need to do that. It's part of their redemption. Now, I think this is one of the reasons why we don't see this sort of talking down aspect happen as much in games like D&D, since it's simply not as fun, or it's not perceived as being as much fun to talk someone down as it is to have a fight with them. And if that's the case again, it's the player's decision what happens. Whatever happens in the end, it needs to be consistent with the story in order to tie up all the loose ends, and it needs to be emotionally satisfying. People won't try and talk a villain down if they don't see them as a real character. If they just see them as an obstacle that they need to get rid of, why should I bother investing in that person if they're just an obstacle? And that's all I want to say. If you got anything out of this, let me know in the comments. Otherwise, if you're still here, feel free to like and subscribe if you'd like to. And as always, thank you for listening.